Imagine, for a moment, that you're standing in a world where the word civilization doesn't exist yet. No textbooks, no kingdoms, no dramatic emperors with insecurity issues, just a group of confused early humans trying to not figure out why water behaves the way it does and why not keeps burning things they swear they didn't mean to burn. It's somewhere around 10,000 BCE, though of course, no one at the time is marking the date. Calendars haven't been invented, clocks haven't been invented, and the closest thing to timekeeping is the occasional grunt meaning "sun go up again." What has been invented, however, is the art of surviving by stubbornness. And as it turns out, our ancestors were extremely good at that. Probably because if they weren't, well, you wouldn't be listening to this story right now. People often imagine prehistory as a kind of peaceful nature documentary. Gentle Ute music, warm sunlight, a wise hunter gazing across the horizon with a suspiciously well-groomed beard. But if you dropped into the real thing, the not sign RSD thing you'd notice is the noise. Early humans were loud, constantly shouting over wind, animals, other humans, and occasionally the existential dread of not knowing which berry was about to kill them. But in the middle of all this chaos, something remarkable happened. Not dramatic, not sudden, more like boringly slow. But history annoyingly is made of boringly slow things. A moment that would eventually do not sign me all future empires, religions, kings, revolutions, and that one coworker who always microwaves not sign SH at the OC, the moment when humans decided to stay in one place. It didn't happen because they had a deep philosophical epiphany. It happened because someone, we don't know who, realized that chasing animals every day is exhausting, and plants are surprisingly polite if you just put them in the ground and wait. Agriculture, the most powerful catalyst of human history, brought to you by laziness. Of course, it wasn't easy. Early farming was guesswork mixed with optimism, mixed with please plant, don't die again like last time. But slowly, painfully, and probably with more swearing than archaeologists will ever admit, humans learned how to grow things. Wheat, barley, lentils, the kind of foods that today would be used to make overpriced health snacks marketed as ancient superfoods. Once people started farming, something even more shocking happened. They stayed put, permanently. Villages began to form, clusters of shelters made from mud, reeds, branches, and the occasional experimental architecture disaster that collapsed in the rain. But staying in one place created a problem no one had prepared for: neighbors. Hunter-gatherers didn't really have neighbors. You moved, they moved, everyone avoided awkward situations. But permanent settlements meant for the not sign RSD time in human existence, there were people living close enough to judge your lifestyle choices. And the judging began immediately. Why is your mud wall thicker than mine? Why does your goat make that noise? Why is your wife better at grinding grain than my wife? What are you hiding under that pile of stones? Us began the earliest chapters of social tension, competition, and the long, proud human tradition of blaming the people next door. But out of these clusters of suspicious, grain-hoarding neighbors, something extraordinary blossomed: culture. Songs, stories, rituals, the earliest attempts to make sense of a world that stubbornly refused to explain itself. People carved symbols. I made necklaces. I buried their dead with care because even without theology or textbooks, they somehow knew that humans deserve dignity. The world was still simple, painfully simple, but not for long. Somewhere around 7,000 BCE, certain settlements took a leap so dramatic it would shape everything that came after. One of them was a place excavated thousands of years later and named Saddle Huruk, a densely packed town where houses were built so tightly together that people entered through the roof like Santa Claus on a daily schedule. There were no streets. Just rooftops, ladders, and neighbors walking over your ceiling at all hours because it was a public highway. The interior walls were decorated with bulls, horns, murals, and occasionally the preserved skulls of ancestors, which, to be fair, was probably less creepy to them than it is to you. I lived close together, they worked together, and they experienced life and death together. I weren't a civilization yet, but they were becoming something astonishing. A society that didn't just survive, it imagined. Across the world, other communities were going through the same slow awakening. In the Middle East, humans discovered that clay, the boring brown stew pound you step on, becomes nearly immortal when you shape it and bake it. Pots appeared, jars appeared, entire containers dedicated to storing things people probably didn't want their neighbors stealing. In China, millet not sign elds expanded. Dogs were domesticated, or more accurately, dogs invited themselves into human camps, realized humans dropped food everywhere and decided to stay forever. Goats followed, sheep followed, cattle followed. And eventually humans invented the not sign RSD livestock-related arguments, which if you've ever lived in a village you know is a timeless tradition. But beneath all these developments was an even deeper pattern forming, one that would soon reshape every corner of human life: surplus. When a community could produce more food than it immediately needed, everything changed. Suddenly, not everyone had to spend the entire day farming. Some people could specialize, becoming potters, builders, priests, traders, storytellers, or that one person who insists on experimenting with new grains and accidentally invents beer. Yes, beer appears shockingly early in the archaeological record. And honestly, it explains a lot. Specialization meant structure. Structure meant hierarchy. And hierarchy meant the very not sign RSD elite, who probably convinced everyone that the gods preferred them to be in charge. This was the moment where humanity took its not sign RSD tiny step toward the world of kings, taxes, temples, scribes, wars, monuments, and bureaucrats who make you not sign LL out forms A through Z before allowing you to breathe. But we're not there yet. We're still in the quiet before the storm. By around 4000 BCE, the not sign RSD true cities were beginning to take shape, places with thousands of people, organized streets, central plazas, and buildings that had no purpose except to show O-pound. Humanity was preparing for its next big transformation, something so monumental that it marks the O-style beginning of history itself, writing. And like many inventions, it didn't start with poetry or philosophy. Number E earliest writing was accounting, lists of grain. Lists of sheep, lists of things borrowed but never returned. Humanity's not sign RSD written sentence probably wasn't profound. It was probably something like, goats missing, find the guy who took them. But writing would explode into something far greater. It would give birth to literature, law codes, kingship propaganda, creation myths, tax records, and love poems written by people who had no idea their romantic frustrations would be read not signed 1,000 years later. And this moment, the birth of cities, writing, and complex society, is where the long river of history truly begins. River that leads to Sumer, to Egypt, to the Indus Valley, to China. River that leads to empires and conquests and revolutions. River that leads all the way to us. But before we drift into the cities and kingdoms that will shape the ancient world, we need to understand the strange, messy, profoundly human transition that took us from mud huts to monuments. And that will take us into the next part. If you were to walk through one of the world's earliest cities, you'd probably be disappointed. Not because they weren't impressive, they absolutely were, but because they didn't look anything like the clean CGI reconstructions on YouTube thumbnails. Os always show perfect brick walls, golden sunlight, and citizens strolling peacefully like they're starring in a shampoo commercial. Real early cities were dusty, crowded, smelly in ways modern noses aren't trained for. But they were alive, truly intensely alive. Let's travel to one of the most important regions on Earth, a place so unusual that historians eventually got tired and just called it the cradle of civilization, as if all of humanity was a slightly troublesome infant being held up by two tired parents. Mesopotamia, a land wedged between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers where the soil was ridiculously fertile and the rivers were mischievous enough to occasionally ruin everything by oozing at the worst possible moment. Yes, it was paradise, if your idea of paradise includes unpredictable natural disasters and mosquito populations with the attitude of street gang leaders. But despite the odds, humans oct here. And somewhere around 3500 BCE, the city of Uruk appeared, a city so important that people eventually started writing poems about its king, Gilgamesh, who may or may not have actually existed, but who did not sign nightly had the biggest ego in Bronze Age literature. Walking into Uruk in its prime would have felt like stepping into a depound rent universe. Mud brick houses stretched along narrow streets. Temples towered over everything, decorated with sculptures and O-pound earrings that priests swore the gods appreciated, even though the gods never actually not sign let out a comment box con not signing this. People carried baskets of barley. Merchants haggled loudly. Scribes sat hunched over clay tablets, creating wedge-shaped marks that would become the world's not sign RSD written language. Cuneiform, and suddenly the world had receipts. Receipts for grain, receipts for sheep, receipts for labor, receipts for the giant pot of beer consumed during the last festival. Society had silently entered its accounting era. Truly, the least glamorous way for history to begin, but also the most accurate. Writing changed everything. Civilization that could write could plan, record, organize. It could track trade routes, land ownership, temple inventories, and the number of people who mysteriously didn't show up for irrigation duty last week. But writing didn't just create bureaucracy, it created memory. Humanity not sign Nally had a way to preserve its thoughts instead of relying on that one old storyteller who tended to exaggerate everything. And because humans are humans, the not sign RSD thing they wrote after accounting lists was complaining. My neighbor's sheep wandered into my not sign eld. Beer ration was unfair this month. Is the tax collector like this? Somewhere in a museum today, a 5,000-year-old tablet still bears a customer's complaint about bad copper quality, arguably the oldest recorded version of "I want to speak to the manager." As cities became more complex, so did the people running them. Priests claimed the gods communicated through them. Kings appeared, insisting they were chosen by those gods. Naturally, this made them more important than everyone else, which they reminded the population of as often as possible. And behind the scenes, real power often lay with scribes. Imagine a world where the only people who can read are government osiles. If you don't know how to read a tax bill, you can't argue with it. If you can't decipher property records, you can't prove your neighbor stole your not sign L. Knowledge didn't just equal power, it did not sign Ned who controlled society, but Mesopotamia wasn't a peaceful place. For every city that ourished, another one eyed it suspiciously across the river. Water rights, land boundaries, trade routes, all of these were reasons for Khan Ait. And because the ancient world did not have lawyers to solve disputes politely, they used the next best thing: armies. The earliest armies weren't glamorous. No shining armor, no dramatic war music. Mostly farmers who were told to put down their plows, pick up primitive spears, and hope the enemy's aim was worse than theirs. But warfare became increasingly organized, increasingly strategic, and increasingly normal. One thing becomes clear the deeper you travel into the Bronze Age. Humans adapt disturbingly fast. Give them a new technology: agriculture, writing, metalworking, and within a generation, they'll use it for something extremely practical or extremely destructive. Speaking of metal, bronze began to transform the world. Mixing copper with tin created tools and weapons far stronger than stone. Swords, axes, chisels, plows, LL became sharper, harder, more pound active. And because no era in human history can exist without creating inequality, access to metal tools created a new social divide. Those who had bronze and those who wished they had bronze. Trade networks exploded outward. Mesopotamian merchants traveled thousands of kilometers, exchanging goods with Anatolia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and beyond. Caravans carried lapis lazuli, cedar wood, tin, gold, textiles, pottery, and occasionally rumors that spread faster than any ocile announcement. And with long-distance trade came the rise of something historians pretend to dislike but secretly love: diplomacy, treaties, alliances, rivalries. Messages carried between kings sealed with symbols pressed into clay. Some rulers wrote sweet letters to each other. Others wrote passive-aggressive letters that basically said, "Why didn't you send me nicer gifts last time?" But the world was no longer a collection of isolated villages. It was becoming connected, a web of cities, cultures, and ideas stretching across continents. Mesopotamia wasn't alone. In the Nile Valley, Egypt was rising, a civilization so obsessed with stability that it built monuments designed to outlive time itself. In the Indus Valley, cities appeared with grid layouts, plumbing systems, and a mysterious script that still hasn't been decoded. In China, river civilizations began laying foundations that would eventually produce dynasties lasting thousands of years. It was as if humanity had collectively decided to accelerate, to build, invent, explore, organize, and compete all at once. But progress never comes without a shadow. As cities grew, so did inequality. Some people lived in spacious homes with storage rooms full of grain. Others lived in cramped quarters, working long hours for the temple or palace with little reward. Laws began to appear not because societies suddenly cared about justice, but because elites wanted order. Rules about marriage, property, debt, and punishment were written on tablets, many of which were frighteningly strict. Fall behind on your payments, you might lose your land or your freedom, or your children's freedom. Earliest law codes weren't exactly gentle. And hovering over it all was nature, unpredictable, unforgiving, and frequently inconvenient. Droughts could wipe out entire harvests. Floods could drown cities. A shift in River O could starve a kingdom. Ancient civilizations didn't control nature. They survived by negotiating with it every single day. But the most important transformation of this era wasn't technology or warfare or kingship. It was identity. For the not sign RSD time, people belonged to something larger than their family or tribe. I belonged to a city, a culture, a world built by human hands. I had stories, myths, gods, customs, shared meaning. The seeds of religion, politics, art, and collective memory were sprouting everywhere. Humanity was no longer simply surviving, it was becoming. And this transformation, this evolution from scattered settlements to organized civilizations, set the stage for the next chapter in our story. A chapter of kings who believed they ruled by divine right, cities that rose to unimaginable heights, empires that conquered, collapsed, and were replaced. And a world that began to resemble the one we recognize today, full of ambition. Khan Ait, creativity, and the eternal human desire to matter. But that unfolds in the next part. If someone from 20,000 years earlier could suddenly appear in the Bronze Age, they would probably stand there in stunned silence, trying to understand how the species that once chased antelopes with sticks was now building temples tall enough to compete with the sky. I would also probably question why people voluntarily lived so close together, because early cities didn't exactly smell like lavender. But this was the New World, ambitious, crowded, determined, and a little bit dramatic. Human beings had tasted the idea of permanence and they were now addicted to it. I built things meant to last. I created roles, hierarchies, routines, identities. And eventually, someone raised the question that would haunt the next not signed V1,000 years. Who should be in charge? Now you might think leadership began with the strongest warrior or the wisest elder, which is adorable. No, leadership in early civilization began when someone pointed at a big pile of grain and said, "I will manage this." And just like that, centralized power was born. Managing grain meant controlling food. Controlling food meant controlling labor. And controlling labor meant suddenly you had the right to build large buildings dedicated mostly to reminding everyone how important you were. Temples rose not sign RSD. Not because the gods demanded them, but because priests demanded them on behalf of the gods, which is an excellent loophole if you think about it. These temples became administrative centers, storage facilities, tax OCES, ceremonial halls, and occasionally the backdrop for disagreements between farmers and osiles who mysteriously kept miscalculating grain totals, and came palaces. If temples were the spiritual heart of a city, palaces were the ego. I were big, elaborate, and designed to make visitors feel immediately inferior. Courtyards, storerooms, weapon halls, reception chambers, all arranged to give you the impression that the ruler had absolute control over everything from the rivers to the weather. Of course, rulers were still human. I got sick, I panicked, I argued with advisors, I made terrible decisions and then pretended those decisions were divinely inspired. But the idea of kingship stuck because humans love stories, and the story of a chosen ruler blessed by the gods was extremely convenient for everyone in the ruling class. One city in particular mastered the art of convincing its neighbors that it ran the show, a place called Akkad. Around 2334 BCE, a not signed year emerged from the shadows of history, a man whose story sounds like it was written by someone trying very hard to impress a future audience. His name was Sargon. According to legend, he was placed in a basket and sent down a river as a baby, which should already make you suspicious because stories like that rarely turn out to be historically accurate. Nevertheless, the part that is true is this: Sargon rose from relatively ordinary origins to become one of the world's not sign RSD great empire builders. Not content with ruling his own city, he conquered others, and then more, and then more, until he controlled a territory so large that future kings would spend centuries trying to imitate him. The Akkadian Empire became the not sign RSD political entity that looked and behaved like the empires we would later see in history books. It had territory, administration, propaganda, armies that marched with precision, and professional osiles who understood the delicate art of writing and uttering things about their king. Empires don't form because of pure force. I form because someone not signed gears out how to organize people at a massive scale, how to collect resources, redistribute them, enforce rules, and maintain loyalty or fear, which works just as well. Sargon mastered all of it. And yet, for all the glory and carved inscriptions boasting about victory, empires are fragile things. I are built on constant e-pound-ort, and if that e-pound-ort weakens due to rebellion, drought, invasion, or a king who is signy not signed cantly less competent than advertised, the whole structure collapses like a badly made clay pot, which is exactly what happened. The Akkadian Empire lasted about 2 centuries, not long in the grand scheme. Climate change, internal strife, and invasions slowly chipped away at its strength. By around 2150 BCE, the once mighty empire fractured. Cities that had been forced under Akkadian rule suddenly remembered they preferred independence. Rebels rose, rival powers emerged, and the memory of Sargon faded into legend, preserved only in dusty tablets and later epic stories that exaggerated everything. But the collapse of Akkad did not mean the end of civilization. If anything, it opened the door for new powers to rise, each convinced that they alone had discovered the secret formula for ruling the world. One of these rising powers lived along a river that behaved with far more politeness than the Tigris and Euphrates. Nile. Egypt's civilization was de-pound or rent from its Mesopotamian counterparts in ways that still fascinate historians. Its geography wrapped it in a natural shield, deserts on both sides, cataracts to the south, the Mediterranean to the north. Its isolation allowed Egypt to develop with unusual stability. While Mesopotamian cities fought each other constantly, Egypt spent centuries resigning the art of centralized government. Nile ooded predictably, depositing fertile soil along its banks like a dependable friend, showing up every year with free gifts. And because the river shaped everything, food, travel, trade, religion, Egyptians learned to move in rhythm with it. Our calendar revolved around it. Our myths celebrated it. Our prosperity depended on it. And at the center of it all stood the pharaoh. If Mesopotamian kings claimed to represent the gods, Egyptian pharaohs claimed to be gods. Quite the promotion. Our orders were divine. Our palaces radiated authority. Our monuments were designed to last forever, not metaphorically, but literally. No king in Mesopotamia could match Egypt's obsession with eternity. His obsession created structures so enormous, so precise, and so astonishingly ambitious that they still dominate the landscape thousands of years later. You know, the ones triangular, made of limestone, casually weighing millions of tons. Pyramids, to the people who built them, these weren't tourist attractions. They were cosmic engines, machines of immortality, a pharaoh's ticket to join the gods. And because Egyptians believed their ruler's afterlife, a pound acted the survival of the kingdom itself. Everyone contributed: farmers, artisans, engineers, priests, laborers who were fed, housed, and organized into massive seasonal teams. It wasn't slavery the way many imagine. It was more like a national construction project wrapped in religious enthusiasm and good administrative planning. And the scale is still mind-bending. The Great Pyramid contains roughly 2.3 million blocks. Some weigh as much as a small elephant. It was built with no iron tools, no wheels, no cranes, and no advanced machinery. Just coordination, skill, stubbornness, and a civilization with a not-sign-night patience. While Egypt crafted its monuments and polished its theology, another great civilization flourished farther east, the Indus Valley. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro had wide streets, drainage systems, public baths, and a level of urban planning that would make modern city councils weep with envy. These cities were clean, organized, and surprisingly calm. No giant palaces, no overwhelming temples, no aggressive inscriptions bragging about kings. People of the Indus Valley seem to prioritize practicality over drama, which perhaps explains why their civilization remains one of the least understood. Our writing system still hasn't been deciphered. Our decline remains a mystery and unlie. Egypt and Mesopotamia, they didn't leave detailed records about who was in charge, which may be the most peaceful form of leadership history has ever seen. Meanwhile, in China's Yellow River Basin, early dynasties were emerging: the Xia, half myth, half history, the Shang, fully real, and the Zhou, deeply philosophical. Oracle bones, bronze ritual vessels, ancestral worship, early bureaucratic systems, all were taking shape, setting the foundations for a culture that would remain remarkably continuous for millennia. The ancient world was no longer a collection of isolated experiments. It was a vast web of civilizations, each with its own innovations, its own quirks, its own contributions to the long arc of human history. And yet, for all the progress, there was a hidden truth that every powerful kingdom eventually discovered. The higher you build, the harder you fall. Droughts, foreign invasions, mysterious disasters, internal conflicts. History is merciless. Even the strongest civilizations rot from within if they forget to adapt. And the next centuries would bring a wave of collapses, rebirths, migrations, and new powers rising from the ruins of the old. The world was entering a new phase, harsher, faster, more interconnected, and not sign-led, with rulers who had bigger ambitions than their ancestors could have imagined. And that, of course, takes us into the next part. If you look at a timeline of ancient civilizations, there's a strange and beautiful illusion you might fall for: the illusion of smooth progress. Straight lines. Neat labels, arrows pointing from one era to another, as if humanity calmly upgraded itself like a phone receiving scheduled updates. But the real world wasn't like that. Real world was chaos wearing a crown. Civilizations rose with breathtaking speed and collapsed even faster. People built entire cities out of ambition and stubbornness, only to abandon them when rivers shifted, invaders arrived, or rulers made decisions that future historians would politely describe as questionable. By the middle of the Bronze Age, somewhere around 1600–1200 BCE, the world was more connected than ever. Trade ships crossed the Mediterranean. Caravans traveled across deserts. Letters traveled between kings like diplomatic gossip. Bronze weapons clashed on battle-not-sign elves, and the age's greatest powers were convinced, absolutely convinced, that their glory would last forever. It wouldn't. But before the collapse there was the glow, a period so impressive that later generations would stare back at it with disbelief, wondering how people with such limited technology built societies so advanced. In Mesopotamia, new kingdoms rose from the ashes of the Akkadians. Babylon with its ziggurats rising like stepped mountains. Assyria with its disciplined armies and terrifying Ishan-Sai. Hittites high in Anatolia discovered the secrets of ironworking, a technological leap so signi not sign can't that it would eventually change warfare economics and the social hierarchy of half the world. Trade was booming. Tin from Central Asia, copper from Cyprus, cedar from Lebanon, gold from Nubia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Ideas moved with the goods, myths, technologies, rituals, stories. A merchant traveling from Egypt to Anatolia could witness more cultural diversity in 3 months than a modern traveler might experience in 3 years. E-world wasn't globalized, but it was interconnected enough for bad news to travel as fast as good news. And yet, despite all this cooperation, humans never stopped arguing about land, power, pride, and whose god was superior. Wars weren't constant, but they were frequent enough to shape the political landscape like storms reshaping coastlines. Egypt's new kingdom entered its golden age, the era of pharaohs like Hatshepsut, the queen who ruled like a king, Utmos III, the Napoleon of the ancient world, Akhenaten. The king who attempted the world's not sign RSD recorded religious revolution, and Ramesses II, who loved monuments almost as much as he loved telling everyone how heroic he was. Further north, the Hittites perfected chariot warfare, fast, deadly, elegant, the Bronze Age equivalent of a modern tank. Our scribes recorded treaties and laws with a legal clarity that would make modern bureaucrats weep with envy. Mycenaeans in Greece built 40 not sign ed palaces, Mycenae, Pylos, Turins, not sign led with warriors, gold masks, and scribes writing in a script we now call Linear B.I. were not yet the Greeks of philosophy and democracy. They were the Greeks of heroism and war songs, the ancestors of Achilles' world. And they traded across the Mediterranean, sending pottery to Cyprus and receiving luxury goods from Egypt. Minoans of Crete maintained palaces so elegantly designed that archaeologists once mistook them for peaceful artistic utopias, until they noticed the gigantic bronze weapons lying around. In Canaan, small but resourceful city-states balanced between Egypt, Hittites, and local powers, trying not to get crushed by any of them. Our location, the bridge between continents, was a blessing and a curse. Trade owed through them. Armies did too, everything was connected. Everything was prospering, was the height of the late Bronze Age, and everything was about to fall apart, not gradually, not peacefully, not politely. But suddenly, in one of the most dramatic, widespread collapses in human history. But before we walk into the not signery, we need to understand what made this world so fragile despite its apparent strength. At not sign RSD glance, the Bronze Age superpowers looked unshakable. Our palaces were enormous. Our armies were well trained. Our administrations were layered with scribes, tax collectors, priests, and ociles who loved paperwork almost as much as they loved receiving tribute. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Bronze itself was a weakness. It required copper and tin, two metals that rarely existed in the same place. If trade routes faltered because of war, piracy, drought, instability, the entire military apparatus could grind tea.